How much do fecal egg counts and fecal egg samples actually count when looking for worms and coccidia in your flock? The answer may surprise you. Stay tuned to find out more. Today we're going to cover 3 main points, and each one of these points is very, very important. If anything, I consider the third point to be the most important. So make sure that you stay tuned all the way to the end. If you're liking our content, make sure you smash that subscribe button and make sure you give us a thumbs up. The first main point that I want to talk about when it comes to fecal egg counts is that you can do these yourself. Now, the purpose of this video isn't necessarily to steer you towards or steer you away from fecal egg counts. This is just to give you more education on fecal egg counts, what it means and what it doesn't. The first point that I want to make that may surprise you is you can do fecal egg counts yourself. Now, there's lots and lots of people that will tell you have to go to a veterinarian, but the reality is this is something that you can easily do yourself and that you can train yourself how to do for a little bit of money, and in the long run you can save yourself a whole lot of money. If you don't know how to perform fecal egg counts yourself, check out this video right here where I show you how. Point number 2 that I want to make, when it comes to worms and it comes to coccidia, we talk a lot about animals being prone to worms, prone to coccidia, or being immune to or have a certain level of immunity or resistance to worms or coccidia. Now, the reality is this: no animal is immune. Different animals can have different levels of resistance, but in the end, they are all susceptible to coccidia. They are all susceptible to worms, just at different levels. Now, the interesting thing that you need to know about your fecal egg counts is on your farm, a small majority of those animals are going to carry an overwhelmingly large number of these eggs. Just because an animal carries a lot of worms or a lot of eggs doesn't necessarily mean the ones that are going to display the signs and symptoms of having these heavy worm or coccidia burdens. An example of this would be our friend Phil. Phil is a ram that we have here on our farm. Phil has very, very high resistance to coccidia, and he has very, very high resistance to barber pole worm. There are times that I've ran fecal samples on Phil. I've looked and seen hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of barber pole worm eggs, but to check Phil's eyelid, he's very, very red. So you need to be cautious, and this is one of those things that helps us to tell you, and it gives us a little bit of clout when we tell you that doing fecal egg samples are very, very important, because you cannot tell if an animal is carrying a worm burden or a coccidia burden just by checking their eyelids or just by going off of their overall health. Some of your worst carriers are going to be those that show no signs and symptoms. These are those silent carriers in the flock that can cause lots and lots of problems. Now, we aren't going to talk about culling in this video, but just keep in mind that if you have an animal that's carrying a tremendous burden, that may be a consideration for culling later on down the road. LinessaFarms.com is home of Linessa Farms and home of Foundation Feed, so make sure that you check that out. Again, that is www.linessafarms.com. The third point that I want to make talks about the life cycle of the worm, specifically the barber pole worm. I just want to use that as an example. There's some very interesting stuff that goes on with barber pole worms throughout the season and throughout pregnancy cycles in these ewes and does. If you look up barber pole worm life cycle, what you're going to see, eggs that are dropped on the ground, they change into these little worm-like structures. They crawl up grass to a certain point. They eat that grass. They ingest that little worm. That worm gets in the stomach, in the intestine, and it grows and it changes in its life cycle, and it starts to produce eggs. The females start to produce eggs, and they drop those eggs out in the feces, and the whole process starts all over again. It's this big cycle of dropping eggs onto the ground, developing into these worms. They're ingested, they get in the body, they multiply, and the cycle goes round and round. The thing that we don't talk about and that we don't hear a lot about is that there is a dormancy phase that can occur in these worms, and this happens primarily when these ewes and does are pregnant. Now, we used to think that this happened with the weather. As we get farther and farther into this, we start to see that this happens more and more with pregnancy. The interesting thing is we really don't know exactly why. We don't exactly know what the cues are, but what ends up happening essentially is the animal ingests these worms, and instead of growing, thriving, and starting to produce eggs in the animal that we can see on a stool sample, they go into a latent phase inside the animal and they just kind of hang out. So you run into the situation where you have a ewe or a doe that actually has a worm burden inside of her. They appear to be rather healthy, and these worms are just kind of hanging out. At a certain point in the pregnancy, and again, we don't know what the cue is, but something cues these worms to start growing again, and this usually occurs about 2 to 3 weeks prior to delivering between lambs or kids. All of a sudden, this cue happens. These worms kind of wake up out of their hibernation phase. They start to grow and they start to drop eggs. This works out really, really well for the worms because we have a period of time where the mom has very little resistance, very little immune response to the worms, and the babies have very little resistance, and they're taking up these worms now and they're getting infected as well. The interesting thing is not all wormers will help to treat this stage of worm, this hibernating worm. Some that work really well are cydectin and ivermectin. Copper sulfate does work as well, but there are some wormers that don't work very well at all either. So you need to work with your veterinarian. You need to do a little bit of research on this to see what it is that you need to give and when it is that you need to give it. Now, historically, they would worm sheep and goats at about 2 weeks prior to lambing or kidding to help fight this phenomenon from occurring, but you're going to have to decide if that's right for you. I'm Tim from Linessa Farms, specialty in heirloom livestock. Thanks for joining us again today, and I look forward to seeing you again next time.